Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abatoy and Timon Cline. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual host here, Timon Cline, editor-in-chief. And today I'm joined in the studio by Alex Kocman. I'm saying it correctly, I think. And Alex has written for American Reformer before. We'll put his author profile and article in the articles of the show notes. But we want to talk about your book today, Alex. That's recently come out from Founders, which does great work, in my opinion, at all levels on their publishing. Everything I see coming out of Founders, and of course we love Tom Askell and the whole gang there, but everything I see coming out is great quality. And even in the past couple years, just producing a lot of different books on different topics and subject matter have really expanded in that way. So I think it's great. Love what they're doing. And I'm saying that so that, people know I'm honest. You have to say it. It's your publisher at this point. So we'll put a plug in there for Founders. But Alex, thanks for coming on to talk about your book. We'll get into that in a second. Maybe just briefly introduce yourself to the audience for those of them that don't know you. You're a great Twitter follow as well. But you do other things besides write books. So briefly tell everyone about yourself.
Yeah. No, thanks for having me on. Good to be here. I'm a native of Philadelphia, grew up in the church, grew up a believer there, and moved a few hours west. But we live here now in central Pennsylvania. My wife, who is a fellow Liberty University alumnus with me, so go Flames. That's our alma mater, and did both undergrad and grad school there. After that, pursued ministry. And have been serving in the local church, but then also doing some other things in parachurch ministries as well. So today I serve as the Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE. ABWE is the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism, and also serve, of course, with our church as an elder, and also in a few other positions, wearing different hats, as that always goes. We're a part of Faith Bible Fellowship Church of York. And my interests, my passions, and actually my career path and my ministry path have kind of followed this nexus between a love for the nations, yes, but also that coming not just out of a love for cultures in general, but specifically to see the Lordship of Christ over all of those things. At Liberty, I study biblical studies and government. So I'm always thinking, on the one hand, theology, but then also praxis and application in the public sphere on the other end of things. And so in some ways, the book that just came out is the full realization of some of those themes as well, and excited to dive into it today.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I'm a Presbyterian. I became a Presbyterian in Philadelphia, as it happens. And, but my parents were missionaries, have a great affection for the Baptist missionaries out there, although you would be the rival to the IMB. So this is potentially problematic, but we'll proceed anyway. So the book though, that came out this year, right? Or did it come out the end of last year?
Just came out at the end of January. Okay.
At the end in January. We're recording in February. It's called Order to Love, subtitle Recovering the Order of Affections from the Home to the Ends of the Earth. So a bit of what you're already talking about there is sort of implicit in the title. But tell me a bit about, before we jump into the meat of this, why you wrote this book and what the basic contours of it are. What sort of questions you were addressing, either for yourself or for the broader public in the church, and what led you to write it now.
Yeah, the book really began to come to the fore because all of the current Flashpoint issues, from my perspective, culturally and politically within the church and then outside the church, they all revolve around the order of love. We've seen the heat map meme. Many of us have seen the visualization of the results of that study in Nature Communications in 2019, showing that those on the political left are most loyal to these outermost rings of moral loyalty and responsibility, whereas those on the political right tend to identify very closely with that core of immediate family members, neighbors, community. So on the one hand, you have that broader cultural tension between parochialism and then universalism, essentially, is where the breakdown comes. You see it in the church as well, though. You see, we joked a second ago about our differences as Baptists and Presbyterians. But in some ways, that's a microcosm of it, because in some of the more Presbyterian and Reformed circles, you tend to have more of an emphasis on marriage, on family. Obviously, some of that has to do with the nature of the Presbyterian view of covenant, but that's different from Baptists, who tend to focus on evangelism, missions, church planting, and maybe you could say that derives from their view of the covenant as well. But really, you see subcultures forming within evangelicalism along these same lines of universalism versus parochialism. And I think if we understand that better, then we'll be the better for it. And so the main reason that I wanted to explore the Order of Love is not just because J.D. Vance mentioned it about a year ago and put it back into the popular vernacular, as grateful as I am for that happening. But the reason that I wanted to put these concepts to paper is because, number one, I want to see those two sides of the church talking to each other and being more conversant, more effective together, because I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's kind of my fundamental presupposition of the book. But also, I want to see both activists with the heart of missionaries, so people that are engaged in the natural vocation of the political realm, or even just in at the local level, or even at the household level. I want to see them engage with the heart of a missionary. And then I also want to see missionaries with the hearts of activists. I want to see that the type of people that are doing all of the evangelism and church planting and missions work overseas are doing so out of the overflow of this robust, expansive view of the lordship of Christ over all of culture, and that their ministry is more effective as a result. So that's what drove me.
No, that's good. Yes, it should be said, although I guess J.D. Vance is our highest ranking public theologian, that you are not just following the papists. We'll get to that in a bit about what Protestants have said about this. And I thought some of the sources you drew out on that were great to bring into conversation, especially Bob Inc. I think that section was very helpful. Right. So, I think it is funny to point out the sort of tradition or denominational differences in this way in terms of at least rhetorical emphases. But it is it's further interesting. No one's questioning, like OPC is we could rightly classify it as very inward looking and parochial. I think that's completely fair. And even localist, like to a fault. And then, not that they don't do foreign missions and everything, but you could say Baptist denominations have pumped a lot more resource and focus and emphasis into this. But then at the same time, we have disagreements with some of my Baptist friends, about the covenant and the nature of baptism, these things. But they still live the same way. No one's questioning whether Baptists are still catechizing their children and doing these sort of, homebound or domestic, practices that the Presbyterians do as well. And then, statistically, most evangelicals numerically are Baptists or like non-denominational, which we know are just default Baptists. And evangelicals all live this way. They're the best at basically having robust Christian home life and being very serious about their local church. So I think, what you're saying, I do think we all walk and chew gum at the same time, but there is sort of like rhetorical differences in the emphases that are somewhat rooted in aspects of theology. And then those tend to, or have tended to, in some ways, I would say, stunt some of the discourse and like what we're trying to actually get at. So I think you've in many ways in this book cut through a lot of the noise. I'll just say at the outset, it's very accessible. It's very well written. I think anybody with general interest can pick it up and are going to be able to follow the main thrust of it. So right. So the Ordo Amoris, this Order of Loves came back into at least, Twitter discourse and the laptop class discourse after Vance talked about it. And in that context, the emphasis was primarily on the cultural and political. But that's not where you don't begin there right away to begin this discussion. So talk to us a bit about how you approach the topic and sort of orient us before we get into drawing particular applications or analogies from it.
Yeah, what Vance brought up about a year ago in that interview that went viral, that's the occasion. But what you had in terms of reaction to that initially was some people, some liberal Protestants, and also some of the papists came around saying, no, he misunderstands the Ordo Amoris. It has nothing to do with ordering your social loves at all.
Yeah.
And I tip my hand a little bit in that I say I don't think that's the case, but then to really understand the issue, you don't want to jump immediately into ordering our social loves. You want to understand first what is love biblically, or charity, which I think is the better word and one that Protestants should probably recover. And of course, the order of love is an inescapable concept. I've heard some say that it's not biblical. It's this philosophical interposition on top of the text of Scripture. I don't think that's true at all. Number one, we're given an ordo in the first and second greatest commandments, to love God first and then to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's not to say that you should only do one and then maybe when you're done with number one, do number two. They're co-extant with each other, coterminous with each other, but there's still a natural hierarchy or prioritizing of those objects of love. So we talk about the definition of love or charity, but then it necessarily reflects itself in an order. And I take some time and trace that through the Old Testament. And of course, if you're looking at the themes, not only of love in Scripture, it's everywhere. Obviously, we know that as evangelicals, we know that as Christians, more broadly speaking, but also the theme of order is there. The words aren't there, but we don't want to commit the word idea concept fallacy. Because even without the exact words being in Scripture, the concept is there. And of course, even from the earliest pages of Genesis, God is overflowing in love for creation and also ordering things hierarchically. And that's not popular to say, but we need to recover this sense of hierarchy. So you see it in the Old Testament, you see it in the New Testament, and you see, again, thinking about that dynamic between localism or parochialism and then universalism on the other side. And obviously Christianity is this beautiful thing that can pull together the particular and the universal. But most evangelicals understand the universality of Christianity instinctively. As Westerners, we tend to think of everything in terms of abstract universals. And so I labor to show that you've got to recognize that the love of God is gloriously particular all throughout redemptive history. And of course, that's the L in tulip, right? And those of us who are reformed in our soteriology understand the particularity of redemption. But whether or not somebody understands that whole system or embraces it, it's still nevertheless true that God is always working with and loving a particular people. Then out of that, we go philosophically back into the Western canon and try to pull out, okay, so what is this idea of an order of love? And it's always been there, and actually before Christianity as well. You find it in Greek thought, but then in Augustine and later in Aquinas, in others, particularly Bavinck, but all throughout the Reformed and post-Reformed tradition. And healthy strains of Protestantism today do all recognize that there's not just a meta order of loves, God first and then neighbor second, but also a particular ordering of love that has to be done in the social sphere as well. And that's where many evangelicals, in my opinion, get stuck. We know we need to love the world. We know we should love the nations with this missionary fervor, but what does that mean for how I love my nation as well? So it's necessary to find what that actual social order is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you pointed out the Western impulse, and I would say it's especially impulsive for the Anglo-American part of the West.
Yeah, ironically,
yes, to extend your universals to the world, and it's like the most. It's one of the greatest indications that particularity exists, because the rest of the world does not immediately receive or embrace these universals, so it's like you just exposed yourself. Do you think In any case, and like I know you bring up Jonathan Edwards some. I've brought up this many times before. He has a great section in one of his miscellanies where he's talking about like universal natural law essentially, and he's like, we know it exists. We're pretty sure of that, but it's not clear to me that like everyone everywhere has always believed that, which raises this question of is our acknowledgement of it nature or nurture? And he's like, I think it's probably a blessing in providence of our civilization, and not everyone else has recognized this. So it's these kind of things. Doesn't mean they're not true, the universals, or even the way you express them. It's just practically like the recognition and adoption of them differs. So anyway, not to belabor the point, but I think the something you're pointing out too is that I would say, and you can tell me if you agree and what you think about it, but it seems to me that evangelicals today in America, as you said, the universals are sort of intuitive as Christians, and this being normal to us. But then so is the individual, sort of inescapable, and that's very reinforced by the broader culture as well. Certain forms are aberrant or bad, but the fact that the individual exists, and I am not you, this is pretty intuitive. What people struggle with is like the murky middle, is like what's in between those two things of me as the individual, and then the universals that for global citizens, basically. So. I mean, does that make sense to you? And do you have any inkling why we've struggled with this at this point when, as we'll talk about, for much of history, this was not as much of a struggle, or it was at least assumed and just kind of understood?
No, that's my exact viewpoint as well. The murky middle is especially when you get out beyond your immediate neighborhood and your locality to the level of the state, the nation, the people, before you get all the way out to that outermost ring of all the nations, all the peoples. And why is that difficult for us? Why is politics still so dirty? I mean, so much of American reformers' work is showing people that, politics aren't dirty. We can have Christians in this area. We must have solid Protestant thinking in this area. It either is or isn't under the lordship of Christ, after all. But I think it reflects our biblicism. I think it reflects the fact that we need specific Bible verses as evangelicals to attach to everything. And so I have Bible verses for missions, and I have Bible verses for my individual walk with the Lord, and I have Bible verses for my family, my marriage, my child rearing. But when it comes to verses about the nation, well, most of those come from the Old Testament. And then we run into the issue of, is that about Israel, or does that apply to us today? And if so, how does it apply to us today? Somebody that I was speaking with in the process of writing this book shared with me, an evangelical leader. He shared that he does not personally believe that there is any biblical imperative to love one's own people, to love one's own nation. Because he said all of the verses that you go to find that tend to be about Israel, and the import for us today is that we should love the Israel of God, the church. That was his perspective. I can see how he got there, like a math problem. Like, he showed me his work. Like, I understand that your conclusion flows from those premises. But I think you're missing biblical data there as well. And just because some of those are fulfilled in the church doesn't mean that exhausts the natural meaning of those texts. And what we're failing to do there is extend the fifth commandment. We know that the Reformed tradition, but not just the Reformed tradition, understands that the full moral equity of the fifth commandment means that I'm not only loving my fathers, honoring my father and my mother, but I'm honoring my forefathers. Which really means I'm going to honor all in godly positions of authority. I'm going to honor the people to whom I belong. What's interesting is that this actually breaks down on the mission field. So there's so many areas that I constantly find as somebody who's engaged in the mission world, where there's a set of assumptions that we have when we're theologizing or philosophizing at home. And then when you take it overseas, suddenly all of the assumptions shift. And this is one of those, because if you're working with a remote, unreached people group, and one of them, maybe the first convert, comes to faith in Christ, you recognize that ideally they should not come off of that mission field, come home here to the U.S., say to Philadelphia to go to Westminster, and then stay forever. And sometimes that happens, and that's all in the providence of God. And there's prudence to these things. But you, as a missionary, if your heart is for that people, you recognize that the best case scenario for your missionary desire is that that person stays among their own people and is a witness to their own people for the blessing of that people group. And in fact, you would probably argue to that person as you're seeking to disciple him, you would say that you have a particular moral obligation and duty to your people, to the tribe that you inhabit, to bring them the gospel before you consider perhaps coming to the U.S., right? So we understand that principle on the mission field, but for some reason here in the States, blame the post-war consensus, blame the self-hating tendency within the West for one reason or another. But we have I think the tendency to, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I can focus on my individual sphere of influence at a very micro level, and then I can support missionaries abroad. Loving my own nation is the piece that I think most frequently gets deleted in between.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's several things there. I mean, it does seem even in the New Testament. So, I mean, the anecdote of talking to an evangelical pastor and how he's getting from point A to point B in his hermeneutics between the two testaments, makes a certain level of sense, or it's easy to understand why. And and that's not a unique case. I think lots of people approach it the same way. But it's interesting to me that even in the New Testament, you could say that the primary unit of God's dealing with people in providence and in redemptive history still remains the nation. As these groups, mm-hmm. right? All the way through to Revelation, there's something that is that unit, this nation, these peoples, these tribes, however you want to break it down, that began way back in Genesis, and this is how God works out His providence, even in the expansion of the gospel. The units are still the nations. And that these aren't being abrogated or destroyed by the entrance of the gospel. And I think that's to me, this is always, this is self-defeating for Christians in a certain way, because the first time I encountered the idea that the introduction of Christianity does in fact destroy the particularity of nations was in secular scholarship of religion, sort of sociological studies of religion from ancient to modern, that Christianity just erases all this, the possibilities of really actually particular nations. And it comes from a sort of uneducated theological position that this universality is the goal in this literal and comprehensive sense, and so they're not dealing with verses like, God has drawn the boundaries of nations and these things. But so when Christians adopt that, I always think this is very strange and self-defeating. It's putting sort of a wedge between two sources of revelation from God, and also His creation, and then His self-revelation through the incarnation and Christ. So it's this seems strange, and it's weird to adopt it this way. And then, as you're pointing out, practically we don't think that. We're completely fine that Russian and Coptic and Armenian Christianity are not the same. They're same in the universals, generally speaking, but their practice and their expression is unique. And we think that's great, or at least I do, and most people do. So what is it that is preventing the transference of this, at least to ourselves, but also is allowing these contradictions to walk in tandem in people's brains? Why is it that there's all the things I just pointed out are I think people could basically accept, but then they're also maintaining these other contradictions along the way.
Yeah, and by way of answering that, first, just to put a little bit of a even finer point on it, some who want to say, well, yes, there's these Old Testament texts about the particularity of the Commonwealth of Israel. Those apply only by analogy to the church now. Even if you want to say that, what is the content of that first promise given to Abraham given to that early patriarchal group that forms the nation of Israel, is that they would be a nation that would bless all the other nations as well. So even if you say now today, yes, in this covenant, we are a nation, a kingdom of priests. Those things are fulfilled in the church, as First Peter gives us. The object of blessing is still other nations. It assumes the continuity of the existence of nations,
Yeah, that's
right?
a very
Which
good
is
point.
why, as you go to Revelation 5:9, 7:9, and so forth, you see nations included in the eschaton as well. So the real thesis of the book is not just to say there's an order of love and we need to live into it, although that's certainly a part of it. The real thesis underneath of that is saying that grace does not erase nature, but rather it restores it, it redeems it. That classical formulation, and because of that, the gospel does not erase nations; rather, it restores nationhood. It restores love of nation to its proper place. It doesn't erase the missionary task. It actually overflows into the missionary task, because you can't love the nations unless you're loving the nation. So what do you locate at the root of that problem? Why do we hold this tension in our minds? I do think, and this is something that you find in Bavinck, actually, which is that almost every theological error, ethical error, as well as proper, theological error with a capital T, in the history of the church, can be described in some way as an error of either conflating nature and grace, or setting them in this forever, sort of yin yang duality, tension against each other, rather than recognizing the golden mean, which is that nature is restored by grace, not eradicated by grace. So I think that applies to the nation in all the ways that we've seen. But look at the ancient Christological heresies. Those are all versions of this error of not dealing with nature and grace in the proper categories. If you look even today, modern political heresies, Marxism, communism, they're guilty of the same thing. They're elevating the natural. You can achieve utopia through natural means, right? It's all versions of that same, it's species of that same error. And so that's why Christians, we need to be doing recovery work. We need to be reading these older sources and applying it to our political theology today.
Mm. Well, I want to ask you more in a second about, how you talk about grace doing the perfecting, of all relationships, and how grace and nature should be ordered together. But to put a, sort of double click on something you raised with Bavinck, I think this is an important point for certain portions of the audience, maybe the minority, but it's an important point. Is this was, as we talked about at the beginning, the order of loves was thrown back in, by our great papist vice president, and I do remember seeing, this sort of cheap or knee-jerk reaction that this, especially because the phrase is in Latin and Augustine is immediately brought up, this is Roman Catholic stuff. But something you point out, this is a really important point, at least to me, that you bring up from Bavinck, and he describes so well, is maybe contrary to the assumptions of people today, and maybe in the past as well. The Roman Catholic Church actually, it was not that it was too natural or elevated nature too much; it degraded nature, and did this through a series of false dichotomies that the Protestants actually corrected. And I think you can see that beginning with Luther and his doctrine of vocation, as well as his letter to the Christian nobility of Germany, pointing out, that these vocations and these stations are part of the spiritual estate as well. Of course, against the Anabaptists, the other extreme, saying, of course, Christians can hold these because they're good, they're established by God. But the general idea, I think as Bavinck puts it, Rome had put a dichotomy between the consecrated and the profane, these sorts of things. So if you don't mind, talk a little bit about that. So I think it's just a great point for Protestants to recognize on one of the correctives offered.
Yeah, no, because so often when we're doing ressourcement, we do look across the Tiber and see, maybe they're ahead of us on a few points. At least it feels that way sometimes. They have a more developed political theology than many Protestants do. Obviously, that's why what we're doing here matters so much, right? But this is one area where I think we find a better understanding of the relationship between nature and grace in someone like Aquinas, who, you can call him a papist, and that's true as far as it goes. But again, what Protestant sources should we be reading that are contemporaneous with Aquinas? Right? It's that it's that chronological snobbery that we have. We think of everyone as a dirty papist who lived before 1517. When we look to those older sources, you see much more of that balance. Boffink does helpfully draw out the fact that Roman Catholicism, as it existed in his day and still exists in our day, gives lip service to this idea that grace does not destroy but restores nature, but it actually strictly bifurcates the two. Right? It takes marriage as a great example and a great case in point here. It limits marriage to the realm of the profane, and we would say there's some truth to that in the sense that we know that there's no physical human marriage in the eschaton. Marriage doesn't exist in the resurrected state, except for the marriage of Christ to his church. But it takes that so far, then it says, well, okay, the priestly class can't be married because they're consecrated. They're over here. They're sacred, and there's a strict separation between that and the profane. And what you have is there's errors on both sides because they've drawn such a strict separation. The priestly class takes on this very ascetic, otherworldly sort of significance that's above everything else. This is what Luther is dealing with at his time, that the ideal vocation is essentially to be a monk, to be completely separated from worldly life in all of these sorts of ways. And you still have some of that thinking in Rome today. I think that's the greatest calling in some sense. And then meanwhile, everything runs amok in the realm of the profane because, well, it's profane after all. And this is why, just at a practical, ethical level, sort of the average, pop level Roman Catholic neighbor or friend that you might have a slightly looser, even moral code than perhaps your grandmother that goes to her Baptist church each week. Why? Well, because they've been trained to think in different ways about what it means to be within the realm of the profane. And grace is not saturating and restoring nature. Grace is in the treasury of merit, and you withdraw it when you need it to overcome your venial or your moral sin. Right. So it's a very different understanding. Certainly there's the basis of a better understanding of nature and grace in Rome when you're reading Aquinas or others. But a lot of that has been corrupted. And I think that the reformers did a good job of recovering that for us.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's not to, denigrate the angelic doctor. We use them just as Protestants did. And I do generally, reserve my label of papist for those after the Reformation. Everyone before there was much of a choice, but so I think it's right. But what we can see in that is two things: is one, Protestants have resources on this as well, and two, there's general or sufficient continuity with the best of the medievals and with the reformers as well in this. So you can see, this is not. This is not some kind of anti-Protestant doctrine or way of thinking or approaching this question, which is, raised nonetheless. You have to find some answer to it. In any case, that's very helpful, I think. What about, in the relationships? You've already touched on it some by way of talking about the history of this idea, but how should we think about grace doing the perfecting of relationships, not just the compound moral person of the nation, or however we want to phrase it, but the family as well, and you could even say your literal like neighbors. These things. How should we think about grace perfecting these rather than abrogating them?
Yeah. This is where Lewis becomes really helpful. If listeners have read The Four Loves, he spends the most time dealing with the difficulty involved in charity, the way that it's not natural, the way that it has to work harder, because charity is loving in the face of when there's natural difference. Right? There's obviously natural affections that matter. but the Christian call is to love one's enemies and to love those that are different from you and sometimes even seeking your harm. So there's certainly ways like that in which grace reorients us, how we approach the task of loving neighbor. I think a great case study is marriage itself. Most evangelicals, even if we're a little bit wobbly on what headship and submission look like, or whatever, but take the average conservative evangelical that understands what a biblical or traditional definition of marriage is. I think that gives us a good picture of how grace actually comes in and restores nature. So before Christianity, I think that you could say in whole, at a macro level, bird's eye view, marriage as a human institution was a wreck. Right? You have the widespread proliferation of polygamy, of serial adultery and remarriage, and all sorts of aberrant sexual practices outside of marriage, and all sorts of disordered practices within marriage as well. And of course, the Lord Jesus comes and teaches the true meaning of marriage, a man and a woman, and even prohibits divorce except for under very particular circumstances, which scandalizes his hearers. And they learned that, yes, Moses allowed a man to give his wife a certificate of divorce, but it was as a concession. That's not a positive moral good. That's not something that you should just do, any old Tuesday. And as a result of that, and obviously what the Apostle Paul writes, showing the meaning of marriage, representing Christ in the church, as a result, you have in space and time and in history the restoration, not perfectly, but generally in cultures that are touched by the gospel. As the gospel expands, you have a restoration of marriage at a public institutional level. Polygamy, for instance, becomes stigmatized and almost non-existent within the Christian world, broadly speaking. And as things go on, the entire moral framework, moral imaginary of the West, and of other cultures, even in the East, that are shaped by Christianity, again, is reoriented towards the biblical ideal, even despite the fact that in the eschaton there's no physical earthly marriage. So there's an ultimate sort of swallowing up of marriage into the true antitype of the marriage of Christ and his church. So if evangelicals can kind of think through that timeline of the trajectory of marriage throughout human history, where we're at now in the already and not yet of, we have the biblical ideal, it's good, it's a godly thing to invest in your marriage, it pays dividends both in the natural but also in the spiritual components of one's life, of one's family, of one's generations. In churches where we have marriage ministries, we understand that even though we know it's going to pass away the way that we currently know it, then I think if you can grasp that, you have a good blueprint from which to understand something like my love for my neighbor, my love for my nation, my people group, my country, and my love for other objects of love that biblically I should incline towards. And particularly on the point of nation, because again, I think it's that mushy middle where we tend to struggle the most as evangelicals today. I posited a couple of ways that I think that grace specifically restores the natural affection for one's own nation or people. And I'll just briefly go through those. And if you want to take it deeper into that or take it a different direction, that's fine. But maybe it's helpful because I do think putting meat on the bones is helpful. Like, okay, we should love our nation. Great. I would imagine almost anybody listening to American Reformer understands we should love our nation, right? That's biblical, and that's sound. But how does grace restore those natural affections for one's own nation? Number one, by repositioning the love of nation properly within the hierarchy of loves. Okay, so it's not inordinately loved, nor is it hated or insufficiently loved, right? It occupies its proper place in the ordo. But secondly, by representing or by impressing upon us the particularities, the properties of nations, land, lineage, language, law, liturgy, culture, all of the particularities that make up what we would say is a nation, that constellation of attributes, as gifts to enjoy, express gratitude for, cultivate, and steward to the extent that they're compatible with true religion. So again, everything that makes your nation, you are to enjoy that. God gives all good gifts to enjoy, You're to express gratitude for those things. You're actually to cultivate them and steward them for the good of others. Thirdly, by dignifying nations as objects of the Great Commission. God loves the nations. That's why his mission is still to incorporate the nations into his kingdom. And then fourthly and finally, by reorienting national life as preparatory for the eternal society. Just as marriage conditions us for the ultimate marriage supper of the Lamb, right? National life does orient us and order us towards the eternal society. It does serve that pedagogical function as well. So there are very specific, not just general ways, there are very specific ways that if we're informed by grace, loving the nation actually matters. It means something, and not just temporally. It prepares us for eternity as well.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very good. I think too. I mean, you've already touched on it some there, but I'd like to expand it slightly, because the question then that comes, and I agree. Like most people listening here are, as we'd say, good patriots. They already love America. They love seeing the USA hockey team win, and all the things.
Yeah.
They like country music. They like NASCAR. They're full Americans. But the thing that, especially in evangelical circles, maybe generally in Christian circles recently, but especially evangelical ones, the question then of definition of what the nation is, and you touched on some of the attributes in passing there a bit, and I totally appreciate in the book you repurposing Justice Potter Stewart's famous maxim of "I know it when I see it," which I think actually there's part of that for this that is you're actually redeeming that comment with grace is restoring nature there. But I think that's some of the case of you just kind of know it and see it when you see it, and so articulating it like to death is kind of impossible. But there are attributes or pieces of what make a people, a nation, that it does help to sort of draw out and talk about it. These are the common things that define all this, and it's good and it's fine. This is what a nation is. In opposition sort of to, in some ways, what Vance is doing and has continued to do, what we'd call today, bare sort of civic or creedal or propositional nationhood of you share a government, or you share a set of laws, or you share general assent to some ideal of what the good person is, the good citizen is. And you're very enthusiastic. You all agree that postal offices should run on time. Therefore, we're a people, we're a nation. This kind of stuff. So, in opposition to that, providing something thicker when we're talking about what it is that's redeemed or perfected by grace, I think is really where a lot of the action is for people, or even a lot of the resistance to approaching the topic.
Yeah, and I think that reflects again the fact that we haven't much exercised that muscle of loving nation, and so we've reduced the nation to an idea in propositional nationhood, just as we reduce love to an idea. And that's one of the earliest things that we cover in the book is that love, of course, is more than a feeling, as the song goes. Biblically expressed, love is an act. It's not purely emotive. It is, although there's an emotional component to it, it is a decision of the will to consciously place the good of the other above one's own, even at the point of self-sacrifice. That's Christian charity. And so practically speaking, tangibly speaking with our neighbors, it means that we do need to reform as evangelicals and, number one, be rid of a really common disorder that you see, which is that I love in name, I love in idea. I love the idea of the orphan on the other side of the world that I give a few dollars to each month, that I have no actual connection to whatsoever in my moral sphere of influence. But nevertheless, I love the idea of loving that far off abstraction. We need to get away from loving these sorts of abstractions if they're to the exclusion of I'm actually not giving towards the good of my community. I refuse to participate in the school board meeting, or just to be a member of my church, or to lead my own family in worship, or to knock on my neighbor's door and interact with them as a human, more than just waving hello to them while I'm walking by. And right now, it's very favorable and easy to love abstractions, and you see that again within the church, but you also see it culturally and politically. And what love has to be above anything else is practical and tangible, both in its expression and in its objects.
No, that's a good analogy to the is it Compassion International or whatever? Everyone's seen the commercials, and they come, they do them at your church, and I'm sure it's great for raising money, just like abstract nationhood is great for raising money. For both parties, right? This works.
Oh, yes.
It's very easy for, especially where everything's commodified and money itself is now sort of an abstraction. So you're just trading ideas. This is easy, but the abstractions make no demand of you, and there's nothing for you really to do for them either. So it's a very empty sort of relationship in the long run. Although money's good, for doing lots of things. So I think it's a great analogy that hopefully people can somewhat relate to in that regard. This is kind of what we're talking about, and I think something you mentioned earlier as well of these tangible goods. These are earthly realities. And in some sense, there's some sense in the eschaton, they're still realities. It's hard to conceive of exactly what all that's going to look like. But these are good things that God creates himself and provides for us to have good, earthly life. So the cultivation or stewardship of these things is also good. It's not just the stewardship of like a stable government. That's a good thing. But for like the conditions for it, or the underlying, cultural conditions for what you have, which means you have to maintain certain types of culture and nationality in order for these things to work. And that, in some sense, and I think you point this out at various places, there's, people just need this. They are drawn to it in a certain way. They want to have, these things. Maybe they're difficult to define. John Jay gives a great list of basic components, but they are drawn to this, and they keep producing it over and over. So these are good things to take care of and steward. I think and I think you demonstrate that well. Do you think there's a sense, not to sort of return to the same topic over and over, but do you think there's a sense with evangelicals, where they actually, maybe we could say they have a more Roman Catholic conception of these things, in that these types of goods, these types of realities are just not valuable. Like the main goal of the Christian life is point A to point B, and anything you're doing in the profane world, in the secular world, inside of time, the temporal world, is really just about, bringing more people to Christ, and that's like about it. Aaron Renz pointed this out of like in a different context, but basically people, a business owner in a church, evangelical church, the main thing he's encouraged to do is make a lot of money so he can give it to spreading the gospel. There's like nothing in between that he should be or could be doing in terms of leadership, socially, politically. None of that is like ever talked about. Even if we were to say keeping it in its proper order or place, it's still just not there. There's like 2 points on the map. Does that like resonate? Do you think evangelicals just struggle to appreciate or make sense of any of these other sort of stewarding duties that a Christian would have? That it's all either you're preaching the gospel or like facilitating the preaching of the gospel.
Deeply resonates, and there's probably no better way to get an evangelical's attention than to accuse them of being papist on some particular application of their theology, right? Grab them by that impulse. I think that's completely true. Many people can go to the contemporary examples of, you can pick on Crazy Love by Francis Chan, you can pick on Radical by David Platt, and pick on someone that I think many of us in our audience, especially including myself, John Piper, somebody that I would have a ton of respect for. But thinking back to his famous "Don't Waste Your Life" sermon in 2000, I believe, at the Passion Conference then, gives the famous analogy, a sermon illustration rather, about collecting seashells, and look how futile this retiree's existence is, that he's just going to collect seashells in Punta Gorda for the rest of his life. What an empty existence. And certainly if that's the only thing you're literally living for, that's certainly empty. Ironically, I was in Florida not that long ago and heard from one of the locals, we want to plant a church in Punta Gorda, and we simply can't because of that sermon illustration. The second you try to raise funds to reach Punta Gorda with the gospel, you're told that it's unspiritual to do so. And that's where all the seashells are from. And so they literally can't get any ministries started there. And I think that's an example of how this impulse goes awry. I think there's a necessary corrective that we need at times, to remember that, no, we should look to things unseen, not just things seen. There is a priority to the spiritual in that sense. The gospel is the priority in spiritual terms and in view of eternity, but not in such a way that makes all of these things completely irrelevant, as though they don't matter at all. And I think many evangelicals carry a guilty conscience because, well, I'm not a pastor, I'm not a missionary, or a church planter, and those are the noble occupations, right? Just as for a Roman Catholic, well, I'm not a priest, I'm not a nun, I'm not a monk, I'm just an ordinary, profane, as it were, congregant. And we have to think in better categories than that. It's the same mistake that the person made, famously and maybe apocryphally, but of thinking in Luther's ministry, well, the way to make a Christian shoe is to write Bible verses on it or draw an ichthus fish on it. No, the way to make a Christian shoe is to make a good shoe and to make the best shoe. And the same is true in our households. The same is true of our political communities. The way to do so under the lordship of Christ is to do it well, in accord with natural goods, with an eye to eternal goods. Yes, absolutely, but not negating the natural.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I do like to. It's true. I call a lot of, in this realm of thought, evangelicals are like populist papists, for the most part. They've done away with the Pope, but otherwise, a lot of their tendencies, surprisingly, stretch back, or almost in spite of themselves, or subconsciously. But this is one of those where I think they're, in a way, we're very like clericalist again. The clerics are appointed differently. Their standard of success is different. It's more populist now. It's a lot of its popularity in these things, and everyone complains about it. The clerics in this way, but that is how we're functioning in terms of how we treat vocations, profession, and roles within not just the church, but within society. And we've spoken of charity often in this conversation. If people go read the famous City on a Hill speech, Winthrop's model of Christian charity, it's a very different vision of the full body, all the sinews being pulled together, everyone in their station. All of this is important, so on and so forth. So I want Protestants to think more holistically in that way. So I think your book, maybe it wasn't intended at the outset, but myself reading it, I thought about that a lot, and I think it's helpful in at least flagging for evangelicals of other things they should be thinking of that are important, that God has put before them, and they have a duty towards it. In any case, is there anything, you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to keep you longer than I said I would. Is there anything else, as this book's come out and you've talked to people, or maybe just in reflecting on writing it, that you want to convey about it, or maybe even emphasize, that's in the book that you make sure people hear, that we haven't covered in this conversation?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I've found so many individuals who are living somewhere in that space of, because they've grown up listening to evangelical preaching, they feel guilty perhaps about evangelism or about missions. Maybe they were a missionary briefly and they've come home and they feel guilty that they can't stay. Or maybe somebody in their life is pursuing a missionary call, but then there's these questions of, how can I go and serve as a missionary when there's all of these lost individuals here at home? So even within that sort of elevated vocation, right, there's still these tensions of, a real missionary goes to the far away, hard tribal place and isn't just in the inner city ministering nearby, for instance, right? So we have pedestals on top of pedestals, I guess you could sort of say. And you see so much guilt in the body of Christ. And all of those are good and necessary vocations as well. We're not saying we don't need to send missionaries. Obviously, that's my primary vocation here, is to be a part of sending more missionaries abroad internationally. But what I think the book, my hope, my desire for it, and even for this conversation as well, is, and I'm glad you brought up that Winthrop message, it is essentially is that not only would the individual begin to think of all of these other areas of, again, these moral concentric circles and making sure that I'm faithful with first things first, and I'm loving faithfully in the proper order. I'm not neglecting my household while I'm out, preaching the gospel on the street corner and doing cold contact evangelism, but I can't be bothered to lead my own children in devotions, and then my own children become heathen as they grow up, right? That's certainly, there's a ditch on that side. But my hope is also just that the whole body of Christ in general, even if you're not the person who's passionate about the mission field, you're more passionate about the political, or vice versa. You're very disinclined towards the political, towards cultural public engagement at home, but you're very positively inclined towards some of these other vocations. Just broaden your heart, open your heart, and recognize that the whole body of Christ needs individuals assigned to each of those spheres. And you might not think, if you're a missionary with the IMB, you might not think that you need American Reformer. But you do, because if we don't have a strong American church that is also faithfully asserting the crown rights of Christ in the public sphere in the U.S., eventually that church will lose its ability to send missionaries overseas, won't it? And likewise, those who are engaged in the culture war here, we shouldn't. And I've seen some do this. Unfortunately, we retreat to localism and we say, now is not the time to send missionaries because our own nation is on fire, culturally speaking, metaphorically. And of course, that's been true to some degree or another throughout Christian history. The Roman Empire was falling, and it was in shambles, and Christendom was falling on hard times. That didn't mean that it wasn't the time for Boniface or for Patrick to go out and to engage their missionary task the way that they did, and in effect saved Western civilization, right? Because they essentially created a cultural arc for the gospel as Rome was gradually declining over the centuries. And so, without getting too deeply into that, my goal and my desire is that we'd have this whole more holistic picture of the body of Christ. We need believers in each of these spheres. Like we said at the outset, we need missionaries with the heartbeat of an activist. We need activists with the heartbeat of a missionary. We need mothers, stay-at-home mothers, right, with the heartbeat of both a missionary and an activist, even if their only vocation is with their children. Who knows how far those individual arrows can be sent out into the broader world. And if we're not thinking inclusively and holistically about other believers and their vocations that way, then we're going to continue to form these tribal lines that in effect divide us to the point where we're not getting anything done. And that's why we're losing. And I want us to win.
Yeah, that's, and something said in there I can't help but comment on. There's a sense in which, I don't think I can be accused of a lack of nationalism or patriotism and wanting to, make America not only great again, but Protestant again. But there is a sense in which you pointed out that when civilizations or nations are struggling, or you could say, even fracturing at certain points, it's a very good time to have missionaries for the reasons you pointed out. Sometimes God is producing another arc, and it's the reason that Protestants often, you can find this in Turretin, Perkins, others, where they would speak of nations and states as the guest house or nursery of the church. And that providentially speaking, the whole point of them is to protect the church throughout time, to give it a place to be. And so you got, that's part of the duty as well. Sometimes we've had to, in the history of the West go out and find new spots where the church is going to flourish, and then it sort of cycles around. So I think it's a great, in my mind, it's a great thing for missionaries themselves to keep in mind that it is not the ultimate purpose, but there is a civilizational stability and function that comes through mission work as well. We've seen that over and over. So there's, God is producing both tangible and temporal goods as well as intangible and eternal goods at the same time. He can certainly metaphorically, anthropomorphically walk and chew gum at the same time. In any case, Alex, thanks so much for talking to me about this book. Everyone should go read it, because we certainly didn't cover everything that you cover in the book, only what I selfishly wanted to talk about. But everyone should go grab it. We'll drop links in the show notes. Anything else you want to point people towards that you're doing or working on, and also where they can, follow you and contact you, as far as you want them to know how to contact you.
Sure. So if you go to orderedtolove.com, you can get a link to Founders there that'll take you to where you can purchase the book. But we're also hoping to turn that website there into a little bit of a portal with additional resources, because there's so much that the book left unsaid. And we've got some mutuals who've written some important articles pressing the idea further, deeper into the corners, be it into missiology or into political theology. So we're going to start publishing more resources there as well soon. There's the book, and there's the work guide, the study guide with Founders. Those are both out there. I've got 2 other books with Founders that you can find if you're more interested in missions topics. But I also host a show here at ABWE every week called The Missions Show, where we get into matters of missions and Christian cultural engagement from a, let's say, lowercase r, Reformed Baptistic perspective. We do that as a part of ABWE. But we're trying to engage missiology through a sound biblical lens, which is not always done. It's frequently not done. That's the problem in missiology. A lot of it's just pop sociology. We're trying to combat that. And then I also do a little something with Eschatology Matters called The Worldview, and that's just kind of a Christian worldview analysis sort of thing, which maybe those are a dime a dozen, but try to bring a uniquely global lens as well. Again, thinking through the nations and what is the Christian obligation and duty to engage and participate in the Great Commission. So those are just a few things. You can find all of that if you look me up on Twitter or go to alexkocman.com or on Twitter at AJKocman, and look forward to connecting with anyone who wants to reach out. Excellent.
Well, thank you again for your time and for writing the book. Again, everyone go snag a copy. And I didn't know about the study guide. So clearly, you've got small groups or reading groups or whatever. You should grab that as well. Thank you, Alex. And thank you for coming on. And thank you, listener, as always. And until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at AmericanReformer.org. That's AmericanReformer.org.